Hello everyone, I have a few ideas for constitutional amendments. Some of them I admittedly borrowed from others, but will address because for the simple reason that I think they are good ideas. The first one I will share is probably the most popular one that I am aware of. The first one is term limits. No member of the House of Representatives shall be elected to more than 3 two-year terms, nor shall any member of the Senate be elected to more than 2 six-year terms. All members of Congress who have served in excess of these terms before the passage of this article may serve out the remainder of their term, but shall not run for re-election. There are members of Congress that serve for decades, often well into the 80s. With that comes stagnation and increased entrenched corruption. These limits I am suggesting, I believe, strike the correct balance of putting a limit on the career politician while still giving said members of Congress adequate time to have some impact. Congress is supposed to do the people's business, not be a retirement home. The next one is about congressional pay. House and Senate pay and benefits shall not exceed the median income of the American people commensurate with the amount of hours worked. This shall be determined every 10 years by an independent audit. No wages shall be paid to any member in either House of Congress unless the budget is balanced. Congress votes themselves some very generous pay and benefits for on average half the work hours that your average American works, and their irresponsible deficit spending only adds insult to injury. The next one applies part of the Domestic Emoluments Clause, which deals with presidential pay, among other things, to members of Congress. This subsection in question states, he shall not receive within that period any other emolument from the United States or any of them. In other words, the president cannot directly own a business or trade stocks while they are in office, due to how this has historically been interpreted. This amendment would state, no member of either House of Congress or other federal office, nor member of their immediate family, shall be permitted to own or trade stocks or bonds, nor be allowed to accept any present office or title from any domestic or foreign government or corporation during and up to 10 years after their tenure. Any and all prior investments must be placed into blind trusts until 10 years after their tenure. Sleepy Joe and various other politicians have used their positions to not only enrich themselves, but also family members. I find it awfully suspicious that so many children of current and former politicians have or had employment at Ukrainian oil companies. This proposed amendment wouldn't completely eliminate the problem, but it would help. The next one deals with presidential pardoning power. While I believe it should remain, I think it should rein in a bit. The president shall not pardon nor offer clemency to themselves, their vice president, nor any current or former member of their administration. A former president may be pardoned by the current president with a 2-3 vote of Congress. A president being able to pardon or offer clemency to members of their administration past and present is a huge conflict of interest that needs to be dealt with. And I also don't want to see a future president pull a Gerald Ford where they pardon a prior president guilty of serious crimes unless Congress discusses it first. The next idea would hopefully cut down on these omnibus bills full of amendments that often have little to do with what the bill is supposed to legislate. All bills proposed in Congress are to only address one subject. Any and all amendments must conform to that subject. I have had enough of these bills that have been introduced that are so long and cumbersome that nobody could possibly read all of them in the short amount of time they are often brought to the floor. No more of this, we must pass the bill to see what is in it nonsense. The number of seats in the Supreme Court shall be set at 9. While this won't completely solve the partisan nature of Supreme Court confirmations, it will at least prevent court packing. If expanding the court is that important, then this amendment could be repealed or altered. Members of the Supreme Court confirmed after the ratification of this amendment shall not serve more than 20 years. While the Supreme Court was not intended to be a political body like Congress, lifetime appointments has inadvertently made the Supreme Court more partisan by encouraging members to delay retirement until a president they align with politically gets elected. Ruth Bader Ginsburg took for granted that Hillary would win in 2016, but when that didn't happen, she delayed her own retirement well past the point she could adequately perform her duties only to die in her position while Trump was in office. While we are still on the subject of RBG, I have one more amendment regarding the Supreme Court. The 25th Amendment provides measure for in case a president can't discharge the duties of their office due to disability, among many other things. It is an amendment that would come in quite handy right now, with the current president being an obvious dementia patient. This proposed amendment would expand that and it apply it to members of the Supreme Court, with some alterations, of course. These alterations being that other members of the Supreme Court and clerks working at the Supreme Court could invoke this amendment as cabinet members and vice presidents don't really apply in this situation. Until this invocation is resolved one way or another, the seat would be considered vacant, with said justice taking their seat back if they are cleared, or removed with a 2/3 vote of Congress if they are not. Only legal citizens shall be counted in the census for purposes of congressional representation, and only legal citizens may vote in federal, state, and/or local elections. This amendment idea would still count all citizens in the census for spending and taxation purposes, as there are people that are legally living and working in the U.S. that aren't citizens, such as people on guest worker and student visas, for example, as well as various illegal immigrants. Counting people who are not citizens in the census, whether they are here legally or not, though, gives an unfair advantage in terms of representation to states that have high non-citizen populations, such as my state of California, for example, which disenfranchises millions of American voters. There are also some cities and states which are allowing illegals to vote, which is highly treasonous. If they are so insistent on doing so, they might as well secede from the United States. The next one I am going to suggest deals with the Electoral College. No, I am not suggesting abolishing it as some have, but I do believe it needs to be tweaked a bit. Both Nebraska and Maine award their Electoral College votes by congressional district, as opposed to all the other states that award theirs by majority vote. The victor of the popular vote of a state in a presidential election shall be awarded 2 of its electoral votes, with the remainder awarded to the victor of each congressional district. This would encourage presidential candidates to campaign not just in swing states, but to also campaign in other states, as while many states are red or blue, so to speak, many red and blue states have parts of their states that lean in the opposite direction. I, for example, live in North San Diego County, a part of California that has historically leaned Republican, though in recent years has become a bit more purple. The urban and coastal parts of the county lean heavily Democrat, but the more inland parts are a bit more swing and even Republican-leaning, depending on where we are talking about. This would give far more voters a voice while still avoiding the pitfalls of a national popular vote, which would lead to large states like California, Texas, Florida, and New York drowning out the voice of all the smaller states. We see these pitfalls within the state governments of many states, as a matter of fact, which means that some of the larger states should perhaps consider some kind of electoral college system for gubernatorial elections. What works for one state or another is going to vary quite a bit, and it is something that is up to the people in said states, but it is something to consider. Congress shall make no law either rewarding or punishing a states for passing or repealing certain laws. Congress has been using this for decades as a de facto loophole to the 10th Amendment, with one example of this being threatening to cut highway funds from state governments unless they raise the drinking age to 21. This already violates the 10th Amendment, but adding a bit more protection can't hurt. Congress and the state legislatures shall make no law abridging the rights of individuals to decide to take or refuse any and all medicines and medical procedures, including but not limited to pills, surgeries, and vaccinations. Abortion shall not apply to this amendment. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article with appropriate legislation. The vaccine mandates are some of the most horrific abuses of informed consent and basic human rights and dignity I have seen in my lifetime. Every official that supported and still supports them, and everyone cooperating with this, should all go to prison. No amnesty. Next up, I'm going to suggest repealing some constitutional amendments and even some clauses in the original Constitution, as well as some clarifications of amendments. The 16th Amendment shall be repealed with the ratification of this amendment. The 16th Amendment allows income to be taxed without it being apportioned via the census. With its repeal, an income tax would still be constitutional, though not in its current progressive form. The 17th Amendment shall be repealed with the ratification of this amendment. The 17th Amendment allows the direct election of U.S. senators by popular vote, and also allows governors to make temporary appointments of senators if there is a vacancy. Supporters of the 17th Amendment argued that it would reduce corruption and increase accountability in the Senate, though it has done the exact opposite, in addition to increasing the power of the federal government. Returning the election of senators back to the state legislatures will bring more power back to the states and encourage more voters to pay attention to state legislative races. In the 13th Amendment, I would remove the phrase, except as a punishment for crime, and keep the rest of the amendment as is. Slavery is something that shouldn't be practiced even as punishment for a crime. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment must be clarified. I understand the need to disqualify individuals from public office who engage in treason and sedition, but think we need an amendment making it clear that this can only take effect after a conviction of these crimes in a court of law. One of the main goals of the second impeachment of Trump and the January 6th pearl clutching is to use the disqualification clause to prevent people the establishment docent-like from being able to hold elected office. I would completely remove Section 4 of the 14th Amendment should be repealed completely. There is a hip new argument using this section that stipulates that we cannot default on our debt ever and must continue to raise the debt ceiling forever. This is not only fiscally irresponsible, but also invites further abuse of government power. It has to go. Amendments aren't the only parts of the Constitution that needs to be repealed, so hold on to your hats because I am going to suggest repealing parts of the original, first starting with the necessary and proper clause, which gives Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof, as well as the General Welfare Clause, which authorizes Congress to provide for the general welfare of the United States. These clauses are far too vague and has been used and abused by all branches of government to justify expansions of government power above and beyond what the Constitution originally intended or is justified by subsequent amendments, so these clauses would be completely removed and replaced with nothing. Congress would still be able to write laws, but only laws which are part of its enumerated powers, described just shortly before this clause. For clarifications, let's start with the Second Amendment. I am completely and totally in favor of it, so I am not going to suggest its repeal. While the phrase well-regulated militia was in early 19th century English indistinguishable from the people, the phrase well-regulated militia has been so grossly misinterpreted by so many that it has to go. The new Second Amendment would read, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The Fourth Amendment would remain exactly the same, except with the qualifying word unreasonable removed. This phrase has inadvertently opened the door to various Fourth Amendment exceptions that stretch it to well beyond what it originally intended. This is especially in the Supreme Court case of Terry v. Ohio, which is where the Terry stop, more commonly known as stop and frisk, originated. While one word sounds like a small change, what constitutes unreasonable is not exactly defined. There likely would still be some exceptions to the warrant requirement, such as the plain view doctrine, but they would be fewer and further between. The Fifth Amendment is one of the most crucial parts of the Bill of Rights, but even that has some parts of it that need to be clarified. I would remove the phrases public danger and replace it with nothing. I would replace, nor shall public property be taken for public use without just compensation, with, nor shall private property be taken for any use without the full consent and just compensation of the owner. The new Fifth Amendment would read, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for any use without the consent and just compensation of the owner. This would further restrict the power of the government to violate our rights in emergencies, as well as abolish eminent domain, which is a highly corrupt practice where property can be taken from anyone for any use so long as said use can be framed public, regardless of what the use is. It has been argued before that increased tax revenues counts as public use, when any reasonable person would recognize how flawed such an argument is. Last but not least is going to be the most controversial idea of this entire video, and it would be an amendment allowing secession, or national divorce as it is being called these days. Under current law, parts of a state can't split off from another, without the consent of the state legislatures affected by such a change as well as Congress. An example of this are some conservative rural Oregon counties that want to split from Oregon and become part of Idaho. The Idaho state legislature seems to be open to the idea, but the Oregon state legislature would probably be a different matter, and Congress approving this would be even less likely. My proposal would cut Congress completely out of the equation. In a situation like this, the state legislatures in question would still be involved, of course, just not Congress. But wait, some of you will point out, this has happened before. West Virginia split off from Virginia and Maine split off from Massachusetts. But wait, I am not done yet, because this amendment idea would also allow states to secede from the Union if 3/4 of the state legislature vote in favor of it. If certain counties still want to remain part of the Union, they can become part of another state, or become their own state altogether. For those of you that say this will lead to end of the United States, would you rather have a civil war or peaceful divorce instead? Several state and county borders need to be redrawn, and it may even be necessary for some states or even counties to secede in order to restore what made this republic great. We have a population of over 330 million people. Do you really think 465 members of Congress is adequate to represent that many people? I don't think so, which is why I would also suggest not as an amendment but as legislation to double the number of members of the House. I know it sounds extreme, but it really isn't if you consider that this number has been set since 1929 and the population has tripled since then. Another benefit is that this would make gerrymandering a bit more difficult, still not impossible, mind you, but at least more difficult. I would also suggest that we encourage the same for some of our state legislatures, as some largest states with my state of California have the same problem. Just something to consider. Until next time, see ya.